So today is lesson 12. We've set up our presentation groups. And we've been working with the Trello task list. And you guys have done, wow, we've done a lot here. So some really good discussion and comments coming out of this. So let's look at kind of what we've got so far, and then we can look at a few resources, and I'll add, sort of some thoughts of my own around some of these tasks. So in pre-production, yeah, we've got to move from a staging to production. We've got to figure out the timing, and the timing is important. We'll talk about this one. That's a really key one. Obviously, we're doing our testing, unit testing, and yeah, probably our clients for sure going to need to see it and sign off that, yeah, I'm happy and this is ready to go before it goes into production. Our build framework, design and code. Yeah, that's probably going to happen in a bit of an earlier phase of the project. So again, you've mentioned communicating with the clients. It's vital at this point. We're going to be talking to our client a lot. Populate our content, coding the templates, finding images, finding plugins. Yeah, some of these things might be earlier. We definitely want to test our links. And yeah, I think some of our testing, this would really, I think, be in pre-production. We're going to do these things before. So we've mentioned unit tests here. So we've got that as a duplicate. For sure, our cross-browser checking. Really everything to do with QA, this is probably going to happen before. A lot of these things I'm going to move to pre-production because they're really part of the quality assurance. And then we do the transfer to the live server. We'll come back and talk about this. But then we're not done. So we've got to get feedback, maintenance, testing. Again, that's probably going to be pre-production. But we want to advertise, back up the code, check our SEO, marketing, and our domain. This is probably going to be part of our production task, the actual setting up or transfer of the domain. So you guys have hit on a lot of the important tasks, which is great. So if we think of this we're approaching this last phase. We did our project definition when we met with the client and you guys came up with your proposals. Then we developed the site structure with your specs, your wireframes, and your tasks in FreeCamp. Your assignment 3 was designing the UI. You've been building, and you should be starting your quality assurance now. And we're sort of moving into this last phase with a week to go before our launch date. So some of the other things that we will want to do is hand off. So things like our style guide, any other documentation. So if there's user docs that we have to create, how to use a site, we'll want to generate those. We'll probably want to have a meeting with our client. And we also need to think about training, right? If we're giving our clients some kind of administrative back end, which most websites are going to need, we're going to have to set up accounts for them and show them how to use those things. We can't just give them the site and a login and say, here you go. So we'll want to hand off all sort of our source code, figure out, as somebody mentioned, the backups, as well as things like artwork and the fonts and images. We should be providing those to the client at this point, so they have them for other purposes. So we want to give them access, show them if we're building a CMS, how do they use it, teach them about any other functionality, make sure they know how to log out, and we also set up some kind of help system. But we also want to set our limits around this. We're not going to offer maintenance and training unlimited forever. And this is going to be spelled out in our, should be spelled out in our proposal and contract. A bit surprised nobody mentioned this one, right? When would we do this? Would this be a pre-production, production, or post-production task? Setting up SEO. Okay, Maggie says throughout. Emily says pre-production. I would tend to, Camilo says pre, Hung says post. Nick says probably in the middle. I would suggest these things are largely pre-production tasks. They should be done before launching the site, because the site needs to be fully SEO ready on the day it goes live. We wouldn't want to launch the domain, put our site in production, and then start adding things like meta tags, a sitemap, custom error handling, and Google Analytics. All those should be done beforehand. Yes, absolutely. So this should be part of our plan and part of our timeline. Again, we're not only designing and building, right? This takes time to add all this stuff in terms of SEO. And you would have learned a lot more about the best practices last semester, I think, with Jess, if I'm not mistaken. She would have talked in a lot more detail about these things. But yeah, this would be, I think, part of your pre-production. So we'd probably want it here. We could do some promotion, depending on who our client is. We want to do some promotion again in pre-production. So advertising on social media, driving traffic, where our new site is coming on this day. We might blog about it. We might set up an email account. We may have a press release, even a release event, live event at our client location, for example. So now there is a warning that comes with this, is if we're going to promote the sites, then we've got to be pretty confident that it's going to be ready for our go live date, or we're going to wind up potentially disappointing a lot of people. So we do this stuff, but we do it once we're pretty confident that the date we have in mind is going to work. In actual production, right, we're going to either have to set up a domain or transfer it. Let's say they already have an old site, maybe on a different host, and we're going to move that to a new host. We may have data migration. This is often a big stumbling block. If we're building some kind of custom application, often we have to move data from an old system into a new one, which means at some point we have to shut the old one off and turn the new one on. So there can be some outage or lag there. We should think about a rollback plan. What happens if things just don't launch properly? Do we still have an old system or old site in place we can put back up? Right? We need to have, as somebody mentioned, we need to have the backups in place. We need to have SSL. We also need to think about any APIs and transitions. So we call this kind of transition from an older system or from out of testing into production. Common term you might hear is called a cutover. When you move from an old system to a new one, or move from testing services to live ones. What would be some examples of APIs that we would have to transition, maybe from a testing environment to a production environment, that would involve changing settings and doing testing? What kinds of online services have both a testing mode and a production mode? I know some of you are working with some of these services in our Thursday class for your final tutorial. Okay, so GitHub is one. Yep, right, because maybe we're deploying to a staging server from a staging branch. So we don't want to deploy the staging branch to production. Okay, so yes, if we're using something like Netlify, true. What if we're doing any kind of commercial transactions? Yep, so our hosting, again, we might have a staging domain to a production domain. Yeah, so if we have something like a gateway, we're using PayPal, we're using Stripe, or any kind of payment, all of those gateways come with a test mode. They come with a test mode where we can put through transactions when we're doing testing, and it won't actually charge credit cards. But once our site goes live, we're going to have to toggle that code. So when our site is live, we want those credit cards to actually get charged. So any APIs involved with financial transactions, we're going to have to transfer those from a testing mode to a production or a live mode. And there's usually some configuration value that we'll have to switch in a payment gateway, right? I know some of you are, I think, are working in our Thursday class doing a tutorial on PayPal. Well, PayPal has a sandbox account. So we can use the sandbox for testing, but we need to switch it to production mode when our site goes live, or else people are going to be putting through their credit cards and the cards are never going to be charged. Okay. So any kind of services like that that have a test mode, we're going to have to move those into production mode and run those live. So this stuff takes time. We have to do all of it in that production. So it's a really stressful environment. I won't lie to you. Even now, for as many sites as I've launched, to put a new site live, even a small one, there's anxiety around, is this going to go well? Am I properly prepared? And then post-launch, we've got to think about, you know, we need to stay dialed in. Once you launch a site, it's not the time to go on vacation. Because if there are going to be issues, and there almost always are, they're likely going to crop up as soon as people start using the application. Hey, I tried this, it didn't work. I don't understand this. This is broken. So you need to be in constant communication with your client and monitoring your site. So you got to set up contact channels, whether you're using live chat, email, some kind of bug tracking. Pay attention to the warranty you've offered your customer and have some sort of issue tracking system. You see, these are all things we can expect once our site does move into production. And then not only do we want to stay tuned in for, bug fixes and things, but then we want to start to think about the next version of the site. Okay, so what were all the things that either our client asked for, or they decided we removed from the scope because it was too big, right? We need to get the site up and running, but what things is our client going to want down the road? So we can start planning those things. We can use things like Google Analytics to get a sense of how the site is being used. Is it being used in the ways we anticipated? How are people finding it? Do we need to tweak our SEO strategy, our Google Ads strategy, etc.? Are we tracking errors? And then are there ways that we need to look at optimizing performance? Are things slow? Are people leaving the site? So we want to take some reflection so we can look at how do we improve moving forward and how do we make more money from continued work. And then there's some of the other benefits. If we've done a good job, we're entitled to take some credit. So ideally, we want to have our name or company name in the footer of the site. We want to promote our client's site on our own social media channels. This helps our client. It helps drive traffic to them. and we want to show our client that we're invested in their success. But it also means we can take credit on our own channels and show our work. We may want to add it to our own portfolio, do up a case study, and we may want to ask our client for a testimonial, right? Give us a quote that we can feature in our own branding, our own site, our own social media that shows people we've got a satisfied customer. So we've got a really good list here. I think there are just a few other things from here that I want you to think about as well. Okay, these slides are here on Blackboard for you to reference. This is this launch and beyond item here. A couple of other things I just wanted to come back to here. This is a kind of an interesting one, the launch date. So how do we figure this out? When is a good time? And this can be, and it's kind of two different answers. One is when somebody has no website at all. So we're just creating a site where one didn't exist. The other scenario is we're replacing an old site or an old application. So what do you think in those two scenarios? When is a good time to actually publish into production and launch a site? So one scenario, which I'll put in the chat, new site, no replacement. Second scenario is new site replaces old site. When is a good time for launching new sites? Okay. Interesting opinion. So Emily says there isn't one. We just have to find a date and a timeline. And thanks, Emily. What other people think? In either scenario, brand new site or a replacement site? In my mind, I would launch these two at different, like what day of the week and what time of day. When would you launch a brand new site? When would you put up a site that's replacing an old one? Maggie says a new site first thing Monday morning. Hung says really as soon as it's ready. Janelle says Monday morning for a new site.
Wait, can it depend on the type of site it is?
I think that's a really good point, Maggie. Do you want to explain what you're thinking?
Well, because if you have like a static site that's a business site, then essentially like a Monday morning would be good because of business hours. But if you're doing something that is a product based and is more based on a social interaction or more of the social media, you'd want to pick the dates that are the highest for those kind of sites. So it would be like a Wednesday or like a Friday, and it would be either mid morning or at 4 o'clock because that's when those sites have the heaviest traffic.
Okay, that's a really good point. Thanks for raising that. I'll come to the other comments in just a second. Any other thoughts about what Maggie said? That maybe it depends on the purpose and the audience of the sites? Okay, Maggie, I totally agree with you, particularly for a new site. And Emily says you agree. Does it more relate to social media? I think it's really a question of who is the audience, right? If this is primarily a business site, then yes, and it's new, I would launch it early Monday morning. Probably, I think 8 a.m. before a lot of businesses open at 9 is when I would plan to have the new site ready. However, if it's not so much, our audience isn't so much a business site, it's more of something social or recreational, then I would think about potentially, more of a consumer site, potentially end of the business day or even on a weekend, which is when, people are doing things for fun online, looking for vacations or interacting with entertainment. So maybe a late afternoon as people come home from work, for example. But if it was a site primarily designed for business, then yes, definitely I would be doing it first thing Monday morning. I'm going to just want to read some of the other comments. So Nick made a good point. Yeah, it might be a good idea to hit all the time zones or the time zones of the target audience. So that's a really interesting point as well, right? What is our range? Like, are we local, just within our own time zone? Or are we marketing this broadly and we've got users in different time zones? So we have to think about who the audience is. Now, so that's that first scenario of a new site. And Hung addressed the second scenario, right? That we're actually replacing an older site. And Hung suggests a low traffic time. And definitely in my experience, I would agree. If we're replacing an existing application, then we typically want to do it at a low traffic time. So think about, for example, if you have software that updates, like if the college is going to do an update to a system like Blackboard or Banner, when do they typically do it? What day of the week or what time of day do you expect major updates to be done on applications that you use, maybe even apps on your phone? When do they update? At night, on the weekend, middle of the night? Yeah, so we really would need to try to identify what are low traffic times. And typically, not for all sites, but for most sites, it's going to be late at night and or on the weekend. So a system like Blackboard that we know has lots of users, Monday morning at 9 a.m. is not the time to do a Blackboard update, right? It's too disruptive. So we really have to think about how do we inconvenience people, the fewest number of people for as short a time as possible. So for a big site, if we're replacing an old one, you're going to be doing it on the weekend if it's for a business or late at night. For example, when we did updates when I was working for Walmart Canada, we did our updates, we started them at midnight. Often like a Friday night at midnight or Sunday at midnight, we would start the updates. So that way, if the site had to go down or if something broke, we were interrupting fewer people. Yes, Hung, and that's very true. And that's where our analytics are going to help us, right? They're going to identify the traffic patterns on the site. So yes, it may, but those traffic patterns are generally going to be tied to particular days and times. So we'll want to try and identify low traffic days and times for doing those updates. Very good point. I also want to talk about the domain a little bit. Just going to look at our time and figure out our break. Okay, you know what? It's 9:49 by my clock, my count clock. So tell you what we'll do. Let's take a 10-minute break here. There's a few more items related to our production and launch phase that I want to talk about. So we'll take a 10-minute break here. We're going to talk about domain names in particular when we come back. I want to go through some of those mechanics because they're important that everybody knows how to do. We'll look at a sample launch plan for a major web project. And then we're going to look at one other resource around the launch phase. So we'll probably have another, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 minutes tops when we come back. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break here. We'll resume at 10.